Colleagues, let's get started. We made a promise that we'll start at 5 o'clock, so it is 1 minute past 5. So just keeps his promises. Welcome to the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. We are pretty excited that we have such a large crowd. I think it is the biggest crowd that JAS has had. Thank you very much for coming. I know it is late in the afternoon. I was talking to my colleagues. Why do you have so many people? Is it because JAS is popular, or is it because Professor Marwala is popular? Or perhaps it is just not about him. It is Professor Ted Metz who would be responding. I suspect it is the latter. We do not want to waste a lot of time because, as I can see, you guys did not come here to listen to me. You came to listen to the Vice Chancellor to deliver his lecture. Just before I sit down, I just want to advertise just a few things. We are going to have quite a lot of events this month. On the 18th of March, we have a conference on economics, which will be here. On the 20th of March, Professor Zakes Mda will launch his new novel, The Zulus of New York. We are looking forward to that. He's already here in South Africa. From the 25th to the 28th, we have a conference on disease. We are bringing academics from all over the world to discuss the subject. And on the 26th, we have a lecture about the centenary of Estiam Pahlele. And then on the 10th of April, we have a lecture on the land dispossession by Professor Nomalana Mkhize. So the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study is very busy. So I invite you to come to these events, but I also invite you to come and see JAS. It is an amazing space. What we have seen is not even the half of what this institute offers. I'm the new director of the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, and I'm quite excited that we are starting on this high note. And I would like to invite the Vice Chancellor to give his lecture. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I was sitting next to the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, and he is obviously an expert on the philosophy of medicine. And when he had Bongani talking about a conference that is going to deal with diseases, he was saying to me, how come I don't know about this? So you better send the invite to the professor. Thank you very much, Bongani, for inviting me to come and speak about a topic that I have actually been very passionate about for quite some time. I have changed the topic a little bit. It is now the ontology of machine rationality. I think it is actually, sounds very bombastic. And I also would like to thank Professor Ted Metz for agreeing to respond to this talk. So what I am really going to talk about is really the ontology of machine rationality. And there are very key questions that I will be trying to answer. You can all see, isn't it? What is rationality? Because it seems there's quite a bit of divergence of views as to what rationality is all about. But obviously I'm going to be speaking about it from the perspective of artificial intelligent machines. I will talk about something called flexibly bounded rationality. It's a concept that I introduced quite a number of years ago. Bounded rationality was obviously introduced by Herbert Simon, the 1978 Nobel Prize winner for his work on rationality. And then I will talk about the big economic theory of rational choice. And then I will talk about a concept that we introduced quite a few years ago, rational opportunity costs, very economic. Then I will start asking quite crucial questions. Can a machine be rational? That is the first question that I'm going to try to answer. Can rationality be measured? Can we measure how rational something is? And I will also talk about whether machine rationality is subjective. And if it is subjective, can you be able to generalize that to human beings? Subjectivity of human rationality. Then I will talk about collective versus individual rationality. You can be rational as a group, and you can be rational as individuals. If we are all rational as individuals in this room, as a group, can we be rational? We'll talk about the calculus of that. Then I will apply this to markets, financial markets, rationality of markets. Now, what is rationality? When you go to the dictionary, rationality invokes logic. Linguistically, rationality is the art of making logical decisions. I think we can all agree of what logic is all about. And it manifests itself with something called the maximization of utility. For those of you who have studied economics, we talk about quite a great deal about utility. Utility is the usefulness of something. We call it utility. And in fact, the concept of utility comes all the way from Bentham, almost 200 years ago, almost close to 300. Obviously, we know about the maximization of utility. It's a philosophical concept called utilitarianism, the desire to maximize utility. Now, rational decision-making uses complete information. This is the theoretical formation of what I want to talk about, which is processed with a perfect biological brain, but now we have a physical artificial brain in an optimized fashion to make a decision. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a thought experiment. Suppose Minister Tito Mboweni wants to decrease government spending. And there are two options available for him. One is to reduce government workforce. Another one is to consult a Sangoma from a village called Dutuni who gives him a concoction called Mdaka to drink, and this will reduce government spending. This Sangoma comes from a village. I actually come from a village called Dutuni in Limpopo province. So this is a good Sangoma, I can assure you that. Now tell me, which option should he choose and why? Is there anybody who think he should choose option 2? So would you agree with me that option 1 is more rational than option 2? But what is it in option 1 that makes it rational? I mean, this is really what it is all about. Why is option 2 not rational? I think there's a bit of superstition in option 2, isn't it? And so on and so forth. And option 1 actually looks more rational. It looks more logical. That if you reduce government workforce, probably the government spending is going to reduce. Now I'm going to give you another example. Suppose Sipho is presented with 2 choices to fly from Johannesburg to Frankfurt. The first option, he should fly from Johannesburg to Addis Ababa, to Moscow, hopefully not on Boeing 737 MAX, because it has technical problems. So he will fly from Addis to Moscow, to Paris, to Frankfurt. And it cost 100,000 rands. The option 2, he should fly from Johannesburg to Frankfurt directly at the cost of 13,000 rands. By the way, his objective is to move from Johannesburg to Frankfurt. There is no sightseeing, nothing. Which option would you think he should choose? Now, there is, in mathematical terms, we will say option 2 is optimized. Optimized means you are minimizing a certain cost. And here the cost that he is minimizing is obviously the cost itself, 13,000 versus 100,000. And secondly, the cost of traveling, sitting on an aeroplane for many, many hours changing thing. So that is what we call rational choice. So rational choice is when you basically choose that option, that available option that actually maximizes utility.
What if the first option costs only 10,000?
If it was 10,000, then obviously we can argue, then option 1 and option 2 will be difficult to evaluate. You will have to look at other factors. But as it is, from a utilitarian perspective, option 2 actually gives SIPO more utility than option 1. And the act of choosing option 2 over option 1 is what we call a rational choice. And rational choice is actually quite a very popular theory in economics. And in fact, the whole classical economics is based on the idea of maximization of utility. Now, but in reality, information is almost always imperfect and incomplete. And if we are actually going to use our brain is not perfect. So, Dean, what is 2 plus 2?
5.
It's 4, How about 93 by 97? No, he won't be able to tell me the answer, even if I give him 10 minutes. He will need a calculator. So Kahneman and Tversky, Kahneman, by the way, won a Nobel Prize in 2003, actually said our minds have 2 systems of thinking. The first one is automatic. He calls it systems 1. That is the mind that he was using when I said what is 2 plus 2. The answer is automatic. And then there is system 2, which is reflective. When I say 97 times 91, he cannot automatically answer that. None of you can automatically. I challenge somebody who can be able to tell me the answer right now. Please raise your hand. None, It is reflective, And it turns out that human beings are confronted with this situation and they alternate between automatic and reflective. And in fact, Kahneman goes further and says, for many reflective problems, human beings don't even calculate, they estimate, they guesstimate. There is a good book that Kahneman wrote called Thinking Fast and Slow. You should read it, it's actually quite a good book. So therefore, human beings don't optimize. They use heuristics, which are shortcuts of reaching solutions. In fact, Nobel Prize laureate Herbert Simon called this whole concept of making decisions with incomplete information using imperfect brain in an unoptimized fashion, bounded rationality. Now, the word bounded means you put a bound. So it is rationality, but it is limited rationality. Do we all understand what bounded rationality is all about? But now, decisions are being made by machines. So how do machines make decisions? You collect data, you put it into some artificial intelligence model, and then you make a decision. If you go to the banking system, when they do credit scoring, they no longer use human beings, certainly not for advanced banks. They actually use machines. And you can even have a feedback, which can actually be used to improve the performance of the machines. This is really where the world is actually going. This is an example of a model. We call this a deep learning. It's a neural network. It has a set of inputs and set of outputs. These inputs can actually be somebody's picture, and the output can be who that person is. It will be a face recognition decision support system. They use quite a bit of this on Facebook, where when you load a picture, it automatically labels who the person is. It's deep learning. But of course, I couldn't escape. This is an article written by Tristan Green. What I liked it was that they were actually describing the article that I wrote. So when you start using models, models are not a reality. They are an approximation of reality. There is a British statistician called Box. He is known for having famously said that all models are wrong. But they are useful, but they are wrong. And they are wrong because they are an approximation of reality. And therefore, they cannot be completely right. This is just a marketing. I'm a good marketer of my books. You can go and buy this book that I wrote on machine learning, and it will talk about how rational machines actually work. It is on Amazon. Now, given the fact that machines are making decisions, now what happens to some of the concepts that I talked about? And this whole concept of machines making decisions is actually famously called the fourth industrial revolution. So machines have system 1 or system 2?
2. They have no system 1.
No, they have system 1. They're automatic. How many think that machines have system? Please, Miriam, your chair is waiting for you here. So, do machines have system 1 or system 2? It's 1. How many think is system 1? How many think is system 2? It's actually system 1. Because they're almost automatic. And they're very, very quick. It's not the amount of, and by the way, system 1 and system 2 for machines is almost identical. Because when you get a number, it becomes a 64-bit ones and zeros. And you are just manipulating 64 ones and zeros and another 64 ones and zeros. Whether you are adding or subtracting does not really make a difference. But now, if it is a machine that is making a decision, suppose you give a machine a problem to solve today. And it uses system 1 to solve that problem. It gives you a solution. And then you wait for 5 years. And you give the machine that you buy in 5 years' time the same problem. What do you think is going to happen? It will process that information faster. Why would it process that information faster? Well, there is something called Moore's law, which basically says that computational processing power actually doubles every 2 years. And that has been the case. Is it 2 or 2.5? Yeah. So what basically it means, for machine decision making, it is becoming faster and faster. Does that make sense? It is becoming faster and faster. Obviously, there might be a physical limit on how fast it can actually become. But once we've reached that physical limit, probably it will migrate to quantum computing that will even be faster, and you will have another version of Moore's law. And then the other thing that machine can be able to do is to optimize. To optimize, you are given an objective function, you put it in a machine, it is able to optimize. For example, Google Maps, if you give it, direction from one point to another, it is able to tell you how quickly you can actually be able to reach that destination. In fact, it can even recommend the quickest way in which you can reach a destination. That is what we call optimization. You are minimizing something or maximizing something. Now, in mathematics, there are two types of optimization problems. You have optimization problems called convex problems, and you have optimization problems called non-convex problems. The convex problems are those problems that you know the global optimum solution to your problem. The non-convex problems are those problems that even if you achieve a global optimum solution, you do not know that it is a global optimum solution. So it's almost hidden. You can't be able to access it completely. Mathematically, certainly, you can't be able to prove. So now, when machines are actually optimizing irregular problems, by the way, I'm worried. I hope the people who are outside can hear. We still have one chair inside. In fact, two chairs, three chairs. Please come inside. So that we can. Okay. Are we fine? No, thanks. So the other thing is when you build a model. I saw one of my PhD students, Rendan, he knows this quite well. When you want to build an accurate model, there's always something called an interplay between the complexity of the model and its dimension. So if your model is too complex, then it loses, it suffers something called the curse of dimensionality, which means it loses the sense of reality. There was a British monk, I think he was a British monk, William of Ockham, yes, who basically said that when you build a model, the best model to build is the least complex model that describes all the observations. It's called Occam's razor. You use it to actually manage the complexity of the model. So if your dimension is too high, your model is too complex, and it does not work very well. If your model is not very complex, then your dimension will be low. So there's an interplay that we need to worry about. Now, given all this, if we remember bounded rationality, the fact that a machine is getting much, much better year by year, what it basically says is that the bounds of rationality are actually expanding. You can be able to exercise rationality with many degrees of freedom using a computer that is actually increasing in its ability to process information than human beings. So that is why we call this flexibly bounded rationality. That rationality of machines is not just bounded, but it is flexibly bounded. So this is a diagram that we draw. So this is where the human being is. Our decision making is very, very limited. So the space in which we can be able to exercise rationality is actually quite limited. Then this is probably the theoretical limit beyond which you can no longer be able to exercise rationality. And when you start using machines like artificial intelligence decision-making systems, then you are operating somewhere here. And in fact, as technology improves, you are actually expanding the bounds. Because it is flexible, you are expanding the bounds, approaching the limit of rationality that is actually, you cannot be able to pass. Now, I'm going to give you another exercise. Suppose a recent graduate was offered these two jobs. Option one, take a job at Microlife, not to be confused with Microsoft, and get paid 80,000 rands per month. And option two, take a job at Deep Thought and get paid 2,000 rands per month. Which option do you think this recent graduate should choose? Exactly.
Option 2.
Why?
Innovative company, and he's going to be making 800,000 in 2 years' time.
How about if we use that concept of economics? If all else is equal.
You're then bounding the decision with limited information.
No, I completely agree. I agree with you. I agree with
In
you.
fact, the more information you have, the poorer a rational machine makes a decision.
Exactly. But from a utilitarian perspective, option 1 maximizes utility for you for the available choices.
Under that small set of conditions.
Exactly. But obviously there might,
Becomes trivial.
but there might be other issues such as work-life balance, maybe, and so on and so forth. So I've already indicated that this is what is called rational choice. Now, how about, and by the way, robots are facing this dilemma all the time. How about if the choices give identical utility? For example, if both of them were giving you 80,000 rands, which one do you choose? So, this is what comes to subjectivity of rationality. Now, this is a thought experiment. It's not even a thought experiment. A robot has to choose one of two paths that give the same utility. The choice of one over another is obviously subjective, isn't it? Because both of them give you identical utility. Now, in economic terms, if you choose one option and you leave another, the one that you have left, we call it opportunity cost. That is your opportunity cost. This is the opportunity that you have forgone in order for you to choose whatever you have chosen. Now, if you are going to do rational choice and you are presented with options that have the same utility, the option that you do not choose is what we call a rational opportunity cost. And of course, for a robot, it normally generates a random number generator so that it can be stuck. And then it's going to pick, or you can flip a coin, and then it will decide where to go, and so on and so forth. Now, how about if it is a problem of multi-objective problems? Are you familiar with the concept of multi-objectives? When you design a car, you have two objectives. One is to make sure that, it's strong enough to be able to run, isn't it, But it should not be too strong that it is heavy and fuel efficiency is high. So an engineer is presented with a situation where he has to choose how much each objective is dependent, is important for him. And a good example is ESCOM. ESCOM has a commercial objective. They have to maximize profit. It has a technical objective. Their systems must actually be able to work. And then there is also the maintenance choices that they have to do. And what they have to do now is to decide, how much should we actually invest in maintenance and technical capacity and still be commercially viable. Of course, that is subjective, isn't it? It depends on what you want to achieve. If your objective is really just to get to maximize profit, you probably will minimize on maintenance, and it's going to be the problem of the new CEO who is going to come after 5 years. And by the way, this is not far from reality. So this is actually what we call multi-objective optimization. And in multi-objective optimization, it is a subjective problem. And if we are going to define, as we have defined, that rationality entails optimization, and that optimization is of multi-objective optimization, and multi-objective optimization is subjective, then rationality is subjective. Does that make sense? So this is an example of what I have just said. So these are two options, but they give you equal utility. And if you choose one, the other one becomes a rational opportunity cost. This is an example of a multi-objective optimization. You have one objective, you have another objective. If you decide that both objectives are equally important, then you will probably be standing somewhere there. If you decide that this is 80% more important than this one, you probably will be actually standing here. And you can be able to draw this efficient frontier. And when you are at this efficient frontier, you are optimizing. It does not matter where you are. You are optimizing. This is what is called the Pareto frontier. And the Pareto frontier is actually subjective. And now, that is when it is embedded into rational decision making, it actually makes such decisions subjective. This is another example when you are building a model, because now we're talking about machines. You have data dimensionality, you have model complexity, and you have an efficient frontier, and then you have to decide how complex your model is, given the level of tolerance you need for your machine to be able to achieve. Now, I'm going to move at another aspect of the ontology of rational decision making. This is what we call counterfactuals. This morning, I visited the dean, who obviously did a PhD in counterfactuals at the University of Cambridge. So counterfactuals are the opposite of facts. Suppose you work for the chemical company. I'm not going to name the name because the example that I'm going to use is not going to be nice. And then there is an explosion. The factual, which is the reality, is the fact that the explosion actually happens. The counterfactual is, if we had done this, the explosion would not have happened, and so on and so forth. And this counterfactual space is actually unlimited. You can build all sorts of counterfactuals, and they will all be equally valid, depending on your objective. Now, this concept of counterfactuals is very important in the field of psychology. It is often said that depression is because of counterfactuals. Only if I studied harder, only if I did not make this investment, and so on and so forth. So psychologists are actually spend a lot of great time studying counterfactuals, because counterfactuals actually have an impact on depression. The people in medical sciences, which is where the dean actually comes from, study counterfactuals because of this concept called, when you want to test whether a drug is effective or not. Yeah, clinical trials. So if you have a piece of medication that you suspect it is able to cure a disease, what it is supposed to do, I'm supposed to say, Ted or Nolita, take this medication and let's see what happens. But at the same time, don't take this medication, let's see what happens, which is physically impossible. So I can't give Nolita that piece of medication and not give her at the same time. And what statisticians have invented, they have invented a concept called a control experiment, which means I give Nolita that medication and I identify somebody who almost looks identical to Nolita with identical conditions and deny them the medication and see what happens. And the difference between the factual, which is what I've done, and now the counterfactual, the simulated counterfactual, actually is the one that is going to give me the causal link between giving that medication or not. That is the whole point of clinical trials. So there are many types of counterfactuals, and one kind of counterfactual. And in fact, for that decision, for that example that I gave of a chemical company where an explosion happened, I was thinking about if the machines were set at these points, the explosion would not have happened. And Alex gave me another counterfactual. If we had closed this factory 3 years ago, the explosion would not have happened. Which, by the way, I had never thought about that. But that group of counterfactuals, now you have the factual, then you have a counterfactual universe. Within the counterfactual universe, you have what we call rational counterfactuals. These are counterfactuals that are intended to maximize the attainment of a certain consequent. Again, that is the other thing. Now I'm going to come to quite a controversial issue, group versus individual rationality. Now, you have 3 people who are supposed to vote. All of them are rational voters. One is going to vote here. There's one objective. He's more interested in what happens to the economy. This person is more interested in what happened to the environment, So based on that, they make a choice. And all of them are equally optimized. This is almost like a Pareto. This is a Pareto frontier. So, individually, they are rational, or they are flexibly bounded rationally. They are doing the best they are able to do. But as a group, are they rational? Mathematically, actually, you can prove mathematically that rational agents collectively become irrational community. Does that make sense? It's almost counterintuitive. So the vote outcome, the collective becomes irrational. Again, when it is machines, it is much easier to even simulate. Now, how can I answer the key questions that I've been talking about? Can machine be rational? Yes, but it is flexibly bounded rationality. Do you agree with me? We all know what flexibly bounded rationality is all about. Can rationality be measured? Now, if rationality entails 3 things, the completeness of the information you use, the perfection of the information processing machine that you use, whether it is an artificial intelligent agent or it is a human brain, and thirdly, all these things must be optimized. Can we be able to measure the degree of rationality? Of course, after the fact, if you are predicting the price of a stock in the stock market, if your intention is to predict that, after the fact, you can be able to see whether your decision was rational by how much you have lost or how much you have gained, isn't it? So after the fact, yes, you can be able to measure the extent of how rational you have been. But before then, can you be able to look at the completeness of the information and be able to know how that I have used half of the information and therefore maybe that it has a certain contribution towards the overall rationality of my decision making? When you build the model, the complexity dimensionality trade-off is also quite flexible. Maybe you can be able to quantify it. And the optimization maybe for convex problems where you can be able to know where the optimum point is, maybe you can be able to quantify that. But for convex problems, you can't, because this is actually quite unreachable. So in conclusion, I don't think it is easy to quantify rationality, Professor Ted Metz. Is machine rationality subjective? Absolutely. Multi-objective contributes to subjectivity. The fact that you might have multiple utility points that give you identical utility also contributes towards the subjectivity of rationality. And the art of building the machine is also quite subjective. Now, I am just going to summarize the ontology of machine rationality compared to that of a human being. The human beings are risk averse. We are risk averse because those who were not risk averse, when a lion was coming to our ancestor, and those who did not run away, they were eaten, and their attributes were not reproduced to the next level.
Or attributing to the individual the average. And that's the problem with machines. The bigger your data set, the bigger your average, and the poorer.
No, we will engage, you know. Whereas machines are utility maximizers. The idea of risk averse, by the way, has been studied quite a bit, you know. In fact, Kahneman won his Nobel Prize was precisely on that fact. The fact that when you do experiments and you give people, you know, here is a wheel that you can spin, and it's 90% that you will win the prize, and the price is 1 million rands, or I give you 100,000 rands and you walk away. And people keep on taking 100,000 and walking away, despite the fact that they have 95% probability that they will win 1 million rands, because they are risk averse. You know. In terms of rationality, human beings are certainly completely bounded. In fact, they're irrational. I wouldn't even call it bounded rationality. They are completely irrational. In fact, that is a mistake. It's supposed to be irrational, whereas machines are flexibly bounded rationality. Of course, human beings work with biases and heuristics, whereas I think rationality of machines is obviously very subjective. I think the rationality of human beings is also subjective. Human beings form all these irrational counterfactuals, and many of them make them depressed, as psychologists have studied, whereas machines are actually, they create rational counterfactuals. Human beings use system 1 and system 2. We all agree, isn't it? Whereas machines use system 1. By the way, if you had a calculator and asked you that question, you would have been able to answer it. Now, towards the conclusion, I would like to apply this to quite an interesting topic called market rationality, Miriam. Are markets rational? I think we should just agree that if markets are efficient, then they are rational. So we can agree that efficiency of the markets and rationality are almost equivalent. However, the participants in the market are human beings. And these human beings are completely irrational. They are risk averse rather than utility maximizers. And because of that, the markets are not efficient, they are not rational. The people who are exchanging goods in the market is full of information asymmetry. There is a thought experiment that was done by Akerlof and Stiglitz, where they say, suppose you have 2 car salesmen. Vincent, you are 1 car salesman selling very, very bad cars. And Mr. Stolle, you are a good car salesman who is selling good cars. And the customers don't know which one is which. And they were asking the question, who is going to remain commercially standing after the fact? And the conclusion was that a good car salesman always go out of the market whenever there is information asymmetry. Because a bad car salesman is much more likely to give a discount than a good car salesman, because he knows that his cars are good. And the bad car salesman knows that his cars are bad, so he better sell them as fast as possible. So this is what we call information asymmetry. But if you take that trade to the artificial world, to the simulated world, where machines are buying and selling things, the degree of information asymmetry in the market actually reduces. In fact, if you remove a human being from the market and you replace them with a machine, the markets become more efficient. Of course, we had a flash crash because of algorithmic trading, and quite a great deal of money was lost. So, in short, removing humans and adding artificial intelligence decision makers into the market actually makes the markets more efficient. In fact, this whole concept of machines making decisions is actually changing the world of finance and economics. And I'm going to talk about quite a number of cases where we are seeing changes in the market. For example, if you go to Oriental Plaza to buy goods, and you go and you have money and you try to buy, you will have to bargain, isn't it? And the reason why you have to bargain is because the person on the other side is trying to simulate your demand curve. I spent quite a great deal of time. I visited India 16 times. And one of the most exciting parts, I used to visit a place called New Delhi. I used to live in a street called House Cars at the Indian Institute of Technology. And if you go to the shop or to the market, you get the price you deserve. If you are a sharp negotiator, and negotiation actually means you have to simulate walking away. You are not really walking away. You don't walk as fast because you actually want to buy that thing. You just want a good price. You know? So basically it's an interplay in order to basically confuse the other person about your real demand curve. Now, all these things now are being made by machines. eBay, people are buying and selling goods. And in that situation, individualized pricing is actually the order of the day. We have gone to Amazon to buy identical books, 2 people, and we got 2 different prices. And the reason for that is because they have both our profiles and they have both our demand curve. Rational expectations is basically an economic theory that says that the expectations of the future is never systematically wrong. When human beings do that, it can be systematically wrong. But when machines do that, it can actually be much, much better because obviously machines are flexibly bounded, whereas human beings are irrational. So there are quite a number of things that are changing. And by the way, these are 2 books that I wrote. Please go and buy them immediately from Amazon. I talked about this. This was the work that we did about the car salesman problem. And our discovery was not just that information asymmetry actually reduces. This was for the course at Cornell University, where they were talking about our work. We also found out that whenever you reduce the level of information asymmetry in the market, the volume of trades actually falls. We couldn't quite understand why. And after thinking about it, we realized that no, information asymmetry is actually the engine that is required for people to be able to exchange goods. So if I have 1,000 rands and Alex has a phone, for Alex to allow me to give him 1,000 rands in exchange for the phone, 1,000 rands must be more valuable to him than the phone. For me to accept a phone in exchange of 1,000 rands, a phone must be more valuable to me than the 1,000 rands. So again, subjectivity of perception of value is very, very important for trade. And if that subjectivity manifests itself in an asymmetrical way, then a trade is actually going to happen. This is another example of what happens when we put artificial intelligent machines to the market. It's written in German, but what it is basically saying, it's basically saying that once you put intelligent machines into the market, the result is that the market becomes more efficient. By the way, much of the work that we have done on rationality can be found in this book. Good book, buy it, I wrote it. Thank you very much.
What happened to the 737 Max?
I'll tell you
Was it
what
rational?
was it clear? Was it clear?
Yeah, very, yes. Yes, absolutely.
You should have a handout of mine. I'm just going to speak through it for no more than 15 minutes.
Social media running.
I found Professor Marwala's talk quite consistent and sensible and even compelling, given the conception of rationality that he's using. And instead of sort of heaping praise and showing you just how consistent and plausible it was given that foundation, I don't think that would be as interesting as providing a critical perspective, one that questions the foundational account of rationality that Professor Marwala is working with. A common thread of the talk was a commitment to what I call in the handout a maximizing conception of rational action. It's a description of how human beings and, by extension, machines ought to behave, how they ought to choose. It's not a description about how we, in fact, act. But according to this view, as defined, an action is rational if and only if, in the long run, it will maximize what's good for its own sake and minimize what's bad for its own sake, wherever the good and bad may be located. As Professor Marwala pointed out, sometimes that's called the utilitarian account of rationality. Other terms in the literature are consequentialist, teleological, instrumental consumption of rational choice. Professor Marwala is right that it goes back quite a long ways in the history of Western thought. You can go back before Bentham even, to Hobbes, to find the view. What I want to do in the rest of my time is give you some reason to doubt the maximizing conception of rationality. If I've got time, I'm going to give you different answers to some of Professor Marwala's questions about what's involved in practical rationality and machine rationality in particular. Professor Marwala did a good job of explaining the appeal of the view. He pointed out, for example, that when we deal with public policy, in the context of public policy, we often want to use cost-benefit analysis. If we're in charge of a state and we have a decision to make that's going to affect everybody in a certain territory, we want to do the best we can for them often enough. And in the context of modern economics, if we're choosing a flight, we want to minimize the cost to ourselves and get the most bang for our buck. So I want to accept that part of the way we make rational decisions, or decisions insofar as they're rational, is to maximize. It's part of the story, but I want to give you four, I think, glaring exceptions. 4 cases in which we would be irrational to maximize, or at least we would be rational not to maximize. Here's the first one, human rights, at the end of page 1. You can begin to see the concern if we reflect a little more carefully on some of the examples from Professor Marwala's talk. So suppose Google Maps told you that the quickest way to get from point A to B was to run over some school children in your truck. Right? You get there quickest, be most efficient if that's what you were to do. I presume you think to yourself, no, I have the most reason not to take that route. I shouldn't take that route. It would be wrong to take that route. There's any number of linguistic terms you might use to express the judgment. then reason doesn't require you to run over the school kids if that's the most efficient way to get where you're going. And then think about that graduate job choice. Suppose it's 80,000 Rand a year to work for Torture and Murder Incorporated, as opposed to 75,000 Rand a year to work as an academic for UJ. Despite the amount of money, it's greater for working for Torture and Murder Incorporated, but I think you're going to agree with me, you've got good reason, and most reason, not to work there. What Professor Marwala ought to say about those cases is that we're not, he ought to invoke an objective account of rationality at this point. He ought to say that torturing someone is very, very bad and not worth the amount of good in terms of the amount of money to the individual. And he would still have a maximizing conception of rationality if he were to do that. But that move won't work for the two examples at the bottom of the page. So first one, from Robert Nozick. Suppose a mob thinks a horrible crime has been committed, and that mob is going to torture two innocent people, unless you, the sheriff in town, frame an innocent person and torture that individual yourself. And we assume that for the sake of argument. It's a hypothetical. There's no third alternative. Those are our choices. Either you, the sheriff, frame an innocent person, torture one, or the mob will torture two people it thinks are guilty. By a maximizing conception of rationality, your only option would be to torture the one. That's the rational thing. If you torture one, then you're preventing two tortures of the same degree, we suppose. But I think it would be rational for you not to torture the one, that is, not to violate the rights of that individual. Second example, a day at the zoo. I can't remember who came up with this case. I used it a long time ago when I taught this material. But you're supposed to imagine yourself at the zoo. You alone are in charge of 5 young children. They're driving you nuts. You're near the lion's den. You do the unthinkable, and you throw 2 of the kids into the lion's den. Here's the scenario. The only way to rescue the 2 kids who are on this side of the lion's den is to throw a 3rd child on the other side of the lion's den. If you throw the 3rd child, the lion will go over and kill the one, enabling you to jump in on this side and rescue the 2. What should you do? What would be the rational thing to do? By a maximizing conception of rationality, you should throw that 3rd child. It would then be a loss of 1 life as opposed to 2. And again, I presume you're going to agree with me that you've got most reason not to sacrifice the 3rd child. What this shows is that the logic of human rights, essentially, is non-maximizing. It's logically incompatible with the maximizing approach. If we were maximizers, the choice would be quite easy in these cases, namely to torture and to kill the one. But insofar as you disagree with those judgments, you're logically committed to rejecting the maximizing conception. Here are 3 other counterexamples to the maximizing view. The first, the top of page 2, appeals to personal ties, or what are sometimes called special obligations or partial duties in the philosophical literature. Consider this quotation. It's from a comedy show that I like. Would I ever leave this company? Look, I'm all about loyalty. In fact, I feel like part of what I'm getting paid for here is my loyalty. But if there were somewhere else that valued that loyalty more highly, I'm going wherever they value loyalty the most. Why is that funny? Part of what makes that quote funny is it's treating loyalty as a value to maximize, to measure, to quantify, and to get the most of. But that's not the way the value of loyalty works. It can be rational for you to be loyal to a firm, UJ, even if, were you to leave that firm, you would have more loyalty in the long run. Similar remarks apply to personal relationships, friendship, and love. Part of what it is to be a good friend is staying friends with your friend, even if you could have marginally more friendship were you to cut that friend off and obtain a new friend. In fact, I think to respond properly to the value of friendship and love just means refusing to maximize along those dimensions. Third counterexample to the maximizing view is renunciation or sacrifice. There can be cases in which you would produce the most amount of good and the least amount of bad around the world by placing the benefits on yourself and letting others suffer burdens. But, I submit, it can be rational in these cases, at least sometimes, for you to place the burdens on yourself and to give the benefits to others. So here are two examples. First one, mom. Suppose mom and her son are both hungry. There's not enough food for both of them. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that mom would be best off if she were the one to eat the food, and use whatever metric you like. Better nutrition for her, she likes the taste better, whatever it is. But suppose, for the sake of argument, if she gets the food, there's the maximum amount of utility or well-being in the world. Nonetheless, I submit it would be rational for mom to give the food to her son, to make the sacrifice. Similarly, with the case of angry dog. In this case, you and a young woman whom you don't know are being chased by a vicious canine. And suppose, for whatever reason, the world would be best off if you were the one to escape. You've got an urgent appointment. You are particularly afraid of dogs. You're sensitive to bites, whatever it is. In that case, the rational thing from a maximizing perspective would be for you to outrun the woman, or perhaps even trip her, to enable the dog to get away. But again, I suggest it would be rational for you not to outrun the woman, or trip her, but rather to direct the dog away, even though that would mean less well-being in the world overall. Fourth counterexample to the maximizing view. The bottom of page 2 is self-regard, or what are sometimes called options or prerogatives in the philosophical literature. And it has the inverse structure as the previous example. In the previous example, the most good in the world would have come about if you were the one to enjoy the benefit. Here the opposite is true. Here I suppose, for the sake of argument, that the most good in the world would result if you took on a severe burden, or a great burden. Nonetheless, it can be rational sometimes to direct the burdens towards others. First case, organ donation. Appears to be a fact that only 1 in 4 South Africans gets the organs they need to survive. 3/4 die without the organs they need, the kidneys, for example. I turned 50 last year. I went for a bunch of checkups. Turns out I'm pretty healthy. I could, at this very moment, or I guess after the talk, go to the hospital, announce that I'm donating my organs, and kill myself. I could. And if I did that, and all the doctors were ready to harvest my organs, I could probably save 3 or 4 lives, for all I know, with the organs I've got. Again, whatever metric you use to evaluate whether it's life or happiness or excellence or relationships, whatever your favorite metric is, the world would be best off if I did that, supposing those 3 people are really going to die without my organs. And yet, I don't think rationality requires me to go sacrifice my life right after the talk. I presume I've got enough good reason to stick around for a while and not sacrifice my life for the greater good. Second case, a piano player. Suppose you're a pretty good piano player and you can achieve a certain degree of virtuosity or expertise. But suppose, further, that if you didn't play the piano and instead helped others to play the piano, there would be better and greater piano playing on the whole. So suppose instead of you playing the piano, you tuned the piano, or you hauled it onto the stage, right? Or you kept it clean. Right? You did whatever it is that other piano players would need in order for them to play the piano. What should you do? On a maximizing conception of rationality, you shouldn't play the piano. You should enable them to do so. But I presume that if they would benefit to only a marginal degree relative to you, you've got most reason for you yourself to play. What do these counterexamples show? Well, they don't show that maximization is irrelevant to rationality. I haven't suggested that. There's clearly something going for it. Or it wouldn't be the dominant theory in the realm of economics, public policy, and machine rationality, so it appears. But what the four examples do suggest is that maximization doesn't exhaust rational choice. There's quite a lot more going on. I don't know about you, but an awful lot of my life is composed of respecting people's human rights and engaging in loving, friendly relationships, trying to be loyal to my employer, making sacrifices for others so that they can flourish. And so an awful lot of my life isn't a function of taking a maximizing orientation towards the world. I'm going to presume your life is like my life. If so, then the question is, how do we integrate maximizing and non-maximizing conceptions of rationality into a coherent theory? That has yet to be done. But after we do that, then we can think particularly systematically about machine rationality and what machines ought to do in order to be rational. One way to put the point of the talk, by the way, is that the conception of rationality that Professor Marwala was working with is a characteristically Western one. It's not the only Western theory, but it stands out. It is salient in Western thought about how to make rational decisions. In contrast, the kinds of examples I've given you of non-maximizing rationality are characteristically African. If we look at indigenous African peoples, they tend to believe in the dignity of individual human beings and to believe in human rights. They tend to think that family first. It's quite important to serve the people before you, particularly members of extended family, before others, even if the world would be better off if strangers were aided. And they tend to believe that there are weighty duties to aid others, even at the weighty expense of oneself. So I'm not saying you should accept the alternative account of rationality I've sketched because it's African. I'm rather suggesting that you should like the African alternative because it's right. I think I've got 2 more minutes, and so I'm going to run through the last. So suppose we go now to some of Professor Marwala's questions about practical rationality and machine rationality. Is practical rationality subjective? Well, yes, in the sense that it's quite conceivable that you might have equal reason to perform different actions. If I've got a choice between helping my one son or the other son, it might cancel out, sure. But no, if what is meant that when 2 actions are going to maximize utility to an equal degree, there's no further rational consideration to be made. The fact that those are my kids gives me some reason to favor them or help them relative to your kids, for example. Can we measure practical rationality? Well, yes, in the sense that we know that some reasons are stronger than others. You've got greater reason not to run over the school kids than you do to get to wherever you're going most efficiently, and I don't care where you're going, really. We can't slap a number on that. Very hard to put numbers on these things, but we do have some sense of weights of reasons. And so in that broad, loose sense, we can measure just how irrationally you've acted if you have mowed down the children. But that's quite different than having a cardinal measurement of utility functions, which is the kind of natural home, natural conception for the maximizing conception. And finally, can machines be more practically rational than us? Well, yes, in the sense that we can presumably program the machines to do whatever we want, and if we want them to respect human rights, and we've got good reason to respect human rights, well, by God, they can do it. And they could probably do it better than we can. Another crazy feature of human beings is our tendency to identify with in-groups and to look at outsiders as pollution and things to be exterminated. Presumably, machines don't have to do that. If we program them right, maybe they could do quite a fine job of acting rationally in the sense of acting in ways that respect human dignity.
Well, I think we should give another round of applause. We have a,
It's coming. It's coming.
you can take for the first round 5 questions, and we'll then give it to Professor Marwala and Professor Mills. So you can take 5 questions or comments. Yes. Maybe let's start from the back, actually, which is where the mic is.
Very, very good.
So,
But all those things, you can put them in the objective function.
So let's start from
Okay, so I have 2 questions, both for Prof. Marwala. One is that I would like to challenge you on that machine rationality is system 1. Obviously, firstly, we are not talking about machine 10 years ago. Secondly, I'm also not sure whether we are only thinking about speed here, the fast and slow. Because when we talk about system 1 and 2, there's also the process involved. The system 1 is a kind of automatic, bypass the conscious process. You know, and the system 2 is kind of slow, you're trying to think through, you calculate. And in that sense, although the machine is faster, and they are getting faster, but they still go through that whole calculation process. They're not conscious, I know. But so in that sense, I'm not entirely convinced that it is system 1. Okay, the second question is kind of, it's on rationality, but not necessarily on machine rationality, because you only changed the topic today. Anyway, it's more on the human rationality. I think it's useful to think about or to criticize rationality on the practical front. I think a lot of the why machines may be more rational and why humans are irrational is on the practical point, because we just have bounded brain capacity. On the other hand, I think we also need to go beyond ethical criticism of rationality, but to think of where is the kind of, why are we so obsessed, or why does the rationality, that concept come from? Like, why we are obsessed with the concept of intelligence? And I think that would need to go through when we compare with animals. I mean, rationality is about we control ourselves, we control our emotions. The opposite of rationality, not all of them, but part of it is emotions. And so one interesting thing is that we human beings, we say that we can control our brains, we have the frontal lobe, that we can suppress our emotions or we do not act immediately. That has been one of the reasons why we, getting better than animals. But on the other hand, there has been kind of interesting psychological, lot of actually studies being done that because we so subconsciously now suppress our emotions, actually it doesn't get away. It actually, over the long run, that erupts. Actually, the better way seems to be, and that will be a rational way, actually, to let it erupt. And then it goes away. So what is that? It's rationality here.
All right, thank you, Prof. I think there's so many things I've learned today. Actually, your first 10 minutes was about what I was working on. For the last 4 months, I've been trying to modify the perceptron. And in my understanding was that at the end, the machine is doing what we have taught it to do. In terms of the learning rules that we have decided, in terms of the learning paradigm we've decided, in my case, my perceptron would work on the supervised learning rule, where I know the output, and I'm trying that the learning rule and the algorithm I'm adopting will finally give me the output. But my question is that there will be that time when that output is not known. And in terms of Ray Kurzweil, it is probably 2045, where Thomas More's improvements have gone to such a place when we are now dealing with ultra-intelligence, where anything that has got that microchip can actually talk to each other without human intervention, to the extent that actually the machine among themselves can actually say a human being is stupid because he's not doing 1, 2, 3. He's not thinking fast in terms of your flops or even in terms of your exabytes. Remember, we have said the Turing test was passed in 1959. So if Ray is saying, but now by 2045, something would happen which would singularize the whole relationship between humans and machines to an extent machines will manage themselves. That's why probably, Prof, there was this ethics conference in Brazil 2 years ago about how far we can go, how far we can allow these contraptions working on their own without us.
My question is actually to both Professor Marwala and Professor Mouse. It seems to me that both of you are getting away with not giving us definitions that are quite comparable and comparing the same kind of domain of relevance of things. So I'm actually quite struggling to understand, and I'd like your comment on both. Whether, Professor Marwala, you are not disguising what are actually epistemological problems as ontological, and Professor Mouse, are you not disguising what are actually ontological problems as epistemological?
Novantu is confusing me now.
Thank you to both professors for a thought-provoking, stimulating talk and rebuttal. Yes, my concern is also kind of ethical and eco-critical in the sense that if you postulate maximization as the ultimate goal, how does that reflect on to from which you are maximizing? So in order for something to grow, it has to grow into something. It has to eat on something. Uncontrollable growth, as we know from medicine, is cancer. So if machines are programmed to maximize, that this is the ideal of what the economic markets should be, where can it lead in the sense of when you have equal objectives and the environment and people and human rights and exploitation and maximization? Thank you.
So I'm also into the fourth industrial revolution. I'm actually in the money space, and I actually lecture on this. And one of the questions or the comments that I always get, that I think we all come across, is the machines are taking our jobs, you know. And you still have AMCU that feeds people on there to say, you know, let's block fourth industrial revolution. But then my answer is always to say, you know what, guys, with GDP, we're going to be more competitive as a country, we're going to produce more, we may be able to export more, import less, and spend less. So that's what I always say to them. But now with this, the argument that the last speaker makes, so you're not going to introduce yourself. Maybe, I don't know you, and I'm sorry about that, but I never got to hear your name.
Professor Ted.
Yeah?
Professor Ted.
Oh, sorry, nice meeting you. So basically, after the comment that he made, which was very keen to say, with his life, being a healthy person, let's say he can save 5 people. By that, you know, how do we sell this to the people that basically the machine in the future will make a logical decision between saving 5 lives and sacrificing one, you know? That basically their fate as well is no longer dependent on their hands, it's no longer in their hands, or even on God, in God's hands. Now the machines are the ones that are going to make the decision. How do we sell this to the people, you know? I think that's what matters, because this is supposed to be benefiting the people at the end of the day.
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. I have 3 things. My ex-girlfriend Virginia, something about machines, and then a little bit about efficiency. Now my ex-girlfriend Virginia, she always wanted me to choose between trifle or ice cream. She never wanted me to put the ice cream and the trifle together. So here's the point. Okay. The machine makes a decision. The human being acts on a decision. Surely we should be looking at a rider-horse situation over here, right? Where the machine provides a mechanism for a human being to make a better decision, rather than to sit either in the trifle or in the ice cream. So that's my first question. Second one, I would like to say that all machines are rational because they operate on an algorithm, a set of rules, and a set of data. So they will always come out with a rational decision. The question of whether or not that is a good decision is a separate matter. And I did not hear that from either of you two. And lastly, we had this discussion about Moore's law, blah, 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 blah. And the bottom line always presented to me as I understood it was efficiency. But just as causality should not always be attributed, efficiency is not necessarily effectiveness. Is the efficient decision being made on a bad set of data an effective decision? I would like you to tell me how a limited subset of decision criteria given to the machine to make its decision on, how can that operate on a very large data set that will simply result in decisions which always end up at an average of the data set?
Again, thank you to you both. Professor Marwala, I've been fascinated by your statement. I believe I got it right. Rational agents mathematically become an irrational community. Is that right? And you said it, you showed us a slide that was about voting. And you have 3 people voting rationally, but it seems that they came up with an irrational aggregate vote. So this has me thinking a little bit about democracy, and I'd love to hear you both respond. You might call democracy a systems 2 approach. It's slow and reflective, and as Mary said, very inefficient. And yet we hope that it's representative and in some way takes us forward. But what I was thinking about are so many recent examples of people voting against their own interests, groups voting against their own interests, not out of any sense of self-sacrifice or the greater good. They actually wanted what was best for themselves, but they consistently vote against their own interests. So what is the future of democracy and the kind of model that you give us? Thank you.
Let's start with you.
Thank you very much for those questions. Some of them were actually quite confusing. No wonder you are confusing me. Epistemology, ontology, which one comes first, you know? No, I think it's a little bit of both. We shouldn't, I really need to just, I really need to just put a little bit of corrections. When you are using machines to make decisions, you are supposed, first and foremost, to put what is called an objective function. That objective function, Professor Metz, can include that you should not run over people. It can be part of the objective. In fact, it should be part of the objective. You know, if you are going to design a car, and by the way, now we have self-driving cars, which, by the way, the Uber one killed a person. I think because it was in a hurry. We have to design these utility functions or objective functions, and they have to include all things good, and they have to eliminate all things bad. We have computational power to be able to do that. All those things we're able to do. You know. You gave a very good story about throwing a child to save two children. And by the way, it's a classic story about self-driving cars that are carrying 2 people, and there are 3 people on the road. What should the self-driving car do if it can't save both groups? You know? And of course, those are not easy questions, but certainly are questions that we need to make sense of. If you have a car that is carrying 3 people and it encounters 1 person, it has to make a decision on what to do, you know, and obviously we'll have to put a decision that would actually be more satisfactory to the population. Somebody was talking about this thing called singularity. There's this story that machines are going to conspire and they will start killing people. I think it's overrated. Machines have been very good at solving specific problems. I still have not seen a machine that will be able to remind somebody to call their mother on their birthday, make coffee for them, drive them to work, you know, and console them when they're sick.
You see my girlfriend.
And if we can be able to build such machines, maybe consciousness is going to emerge out of machines. In the absence of consciousness, machines will not be able to conspire to kill us. So I am sleeping very, very safely without a fear of any machine coming to conspire against us. Now, there was a question on System 1 and System 2. By the way, both systems, even in biology, you are processing information. That's a fact. When I say, Alex, what is 2 plus 2? 4. You are processing that information. Because you are processing that information, you don't say 5. Oh, you did say 5, but you were joking. I assume that you were joking. It was not because you couldn't add 2 plus 2, you know. So both cases, you are processing information. The systems as described in psychology is that the processing of information, one actually requires much more processing power than another. When you say 2 plus 2, it is much, much easier because you have encountered it many, many times. Of course, you have added 2 plus 2, but you probably have never multiplied 93 and 97 more than 5 times in your lifetime. By head, certainly by head, you know. And as a result, System 1 and System 2 is basically means how fast you can be able to process the information. And human beings are limited, that when they're dealing with System 1, they're quick. When they're dealing with System 2, they cannot, many of them cannot even do it on their own. I mean, if I ask you, what is 978 multiplied by 741? Maybe you can write it and calculate yourself, but you won't reach a point where it will be automatic. So it's really about speed. And computers are operating on System 1 with increasing efficiency because of Moore's law. That's what we were actually saying. Now, supervised versus unsupervised. I mean, machines, human beings have excellent capabilities. I can introduce you to one person. Once, I say, this is Bongani. When you meet him tomorrow, you probably will remember that is Bongani. For me to be able to train a machine to be able to recognize him, I will have to give the machine 1,000 pictures of Bongani. And only after 1,000 times, tomorrow it will be able to recognize him. So there are limits. There are limits of machine intelligence in terms of learning. It is not as efficient in learning as human beings, but it is more effective after it has learned than a human being. I think that is efficiency and effectiveness is actually quite important in that front. Now, the whole idea of growth, and I'm going to talk it in general terms, because all investors want their investments to grow, isn't it? In fact, the crisis of capitalism is precisely because of its obsession with growth. that we want growth at all costs. And of course, you can't grow forever because resources are limited. I mean, it's quite clear, that somehow we are going to reach the loss of diminishing returns, and the growth is going to stop somehow if we are around for the next 10,000 years. So we should just be careful when we deal with issues of growth. The issue of machines taking our jobs is an old debate. In the first industrial revolution, when machines were introduced in England, where Alex comes from, there were a group of Englishmen who used to be called Luddites. Luddites, isn't it? And these Luddites used to go to firms to destroy machines because machines were taking their jobs. The Luddites disappeared and the machines marched on. And I think it's the same consequence that we're going to see. Why not combine machines and people? You see, there is me and my student. I think Vincent, you are here. Was my PhD student. We did a work where we gave a computer medical imaging in order to diagnose epilepsy. So you give it examples after examples, and you train this machine, and then it is after that you just give it information from EEG, and then it is able to diagnose the disease. And the study was done where 100 very well-trained doctors were given 100 pictures of those, and they were asked to make a diagnosis. They did. The information was taken away, and then after a month, they were collected again, those doctors, and they were given the same information. They were asked to make a diagnosis. Half of them changed their minds. That's called misdiagnosis. The same thing, a machine, it was over 90% accurate. It never changed its mind. So whenever there are certain tasks, pattern recognition, that we know, we are now quite convinced that a machine is better than a human being. So we shouldn't force the two to work together on things that we know a machine is actually very good. There are also certain things that human beings do much better than machines. Not too long ago at OR Tambo, they decided to introduce an artificial massage giver. Still remember those chairs, you will sit on them and there will be things moving on your thing. When you go to OR Tambo, they no longer exist. Apparently, human beings think massages are done best by other human beings, not by some electric motors and actuators that are located under a chair. So in those things, let human beings do that task because they do it better than that. Where they have to work together, and we are going to have situations where they have to work together. Let them work together, But we shouldn't be prescribing one rule that will describe all situations, because that is not going to assist us. I mean, rational decisions versus good decisions. To me, a rational decision must be a good decision. So your objective function must actually be intended to achieve that good that you are talking about.
This is a predetermined decision on rationality and goodness.
Yeah.
Anybody who invested in Enron at the time when Enron's market was high would have a bad rational decision today. It lies in the context.
But
But the machine will always give the decision it gave on the diagnosis.
But you see, there are two types of rationality. You have local rationality and global rationality, almost like an optimization problem, because it's an optimization problem. So those are issues that need to be incorporated into machines. If you are going to build machines, incorporate those issues. And your utility function must maximize the good in society. In fact, John Stuart Mill, in his book, Utilitarianism. It's a very good book. And thank you very much, Nobantu, because you were the one who gave me that book to read. You know. And somewhere in the book, it says that utilitarianism is to bring the greatest amount of good to the greatest number of people. I mean, that's how it was framed. In fact, the rationality of machines is actually new. Much of the rationality discourse has always been about bringing more happiness to people, you know. So that is quite important. Efficiency versus effectiveness. When I was defining rationality, I said complete information. Complete information. If you are not using complete information to make a decision, your decision is bounded, is limited, and the outcome is going to be limited rationality.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's why we say bounded rationality, limited rationality, because practically you can not be able to achieve perfect rationality. Now, on democracy, I'm not a political scientist, but I'm reminded of what somebody once said, that democracy is not the best system. In fact, somebody said democracy is a bad system. It's just that it's the best that we have invented. It's the best form of government that we have actually invented. You know? So, and we know it has its flaws. We have seen people being elected into positions that clearly demonstrate that the general population has been irrational. And it has not happened once. It has happened time and time again. Is that not the case, Dr. Wongani Mulunga? Wongani Mulunga is obviously the head of JAIS. So thank you very much.
Just three of the questions. First, to Professor Marwala, yes, we can program the computer not to run over children. Yes, we can do that. The trouble is if we take other sorts of values. So if we say to the computer, minimize torture, or we talk to agents and say minimize torture, then we get the kinds of cases we get at the bottom of page 1 of my handout, where it looks like in order to prevent a greater degree of torture, we ourselves must engage in torture. And by maximizing or minimizing a counter-rationality, that would be the only rational choice to make, is to torture one to prevent others from torturing two. And that means there aren't human rights. So if you believe in human rights, you cannot take a maximizing function to certain kinds of actions, I think. Am I disguising that kind of case as ontological, whereas it's really epistemic? I'm not sure what that means. I think that the suggestion is we don't know enough about the case. And if we knew more about the torture scenario, we might make a different decision, but I'm stipulating the conditions of the case and asking what you would do in that hypothetical scenario and what you've got reason to do. And I agree that in this debate between us, we're supposing that a rational choice is a good choice. That's been implicit in the debate between us. Another issue I took wasn't jobs. I took another more interesting part of your question to be about whether the machine should be the one to choose. Right? So Professor Marwala and I were debating roughly how should human beings choose and how should machines be programmed to choose. But you raised a different issue. The machines should be the ones to choose at all. And how we deal with that when power is out of our hands and given to a machine. And I think that raises an interesting set of other issues. We should want the machines to choose if we want to maximize outcomes, and if they're particularly good at maximizing outcomes, as Professor Marwala has convincingly suggested. However, there are other situations or other concerns that, again, might lead us not to want to maximize, and hence not to want the machine. So, I want to pick my next wife. I'm going through a divorce. I'm quite willing to believe a computer could do a better job than me of picking who would be a good compatible mate for me. Suppose that were true. Still, I want to have the final authority, the final decision about whom I marry. It shouldn't be left to the computer to decide, even if it's got better information. So that's another where we care about the process, or we care about having the right to choose, even if we're going to make a crappy choice. And that's a similar response to that I want to make to the question about democracy. Democracy gives you bad outcomes routinely. And let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that if we put all the stuff into the computer, it would be the right candidate or the right policy. So if we take a maximizing approach to rational decision making, we're pushed to give up democracy, at least if that were possible or that were true. So if we're going to be democrats, I don't think we can justify democracy on the basis of its outcome for society in the long run. If we're going to justify democracy, there's got to be something about the procedure itself that matters to us. And that's the way most philosophers tend to justify democracy these days. They tend to say there's something special about us human beings relative to animals that gives us a dignity. And to respect that facet of us, we've got to make decisions together in a territory in a certain democratic way. And there's debate amongst philosophers about what that might be. But in the African context, what's often thought is that what makes us special is roughly our capacity for community, or to relate to one another harmoniously, to enjoy a sense of togetherness, and to cooperate with one another. And if those are key, cooperating, that gives us some reason to favor choosing in a democratic way out of respect for what makes us important, even if the results don't end up looking so good.
I would just thank the two professors for what has been a very great evening. This is what the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies is about. And we invite you to come to some of our events. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Yes, we have refreshments outside in the next house. As I said, we have a lot